This past week, I saw some clips of an interview of a Canadian clinical psychologist named Jordan Peterson. He's a controversial man in several circles. This particular interview was his discussion with the interviewer on the topic of Christianity. And in the process of the interview, at least the clips that I saw, he notes that Christians don't always behave as they should. And he seems to be implying by this that if Christians behaved as they should, then there'd be a different reputation that they would have, but also maybe that if Christians behaved as they should, meaning behaved as God really intended it, or as Jesus reflected it in the New Testament, then Christianity itself may look different. It made me think how appropriate that this particular video fell into my lap this past week, so to speak, when last week we looked at Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Jesus rose up to the upper room and he knelt down before them and he washed their feet. And we saw last week that this is the example that Jesus set for his disciples. He said that if I've done this, you go do the same thing. He left this example for us. It seems like a pretty good model. It seems like a pretty good manifestation of Jesus' intention and of who God is. One of the most famous atheists alive is a man named Sam Harris. He speaks much about the root of humanity's moral decisions or human moral decisions, and that they are based not in a law given to us by a being independent of creation, like God, for instance, who has told us what to do and has instilled in us a law that reflects who he is. He says this is not where this moral decision-making process can be found. Rather, the root of the moral decisions that mankind makes are based on the quest of humanity for what he calls well-being. That humans individually and as a society work to achieve well-being. In very simple terms for our discussion today, I don't want to get into too much detail into this. This means that the decisions which promote human well-being in totality, for instance, like not murdering other people, or not raping, or not, as one of his books describes, lying. All of these are a product of an evolutionary development toward social well-being. He argues, in fact, that the religious systems of the world, including Christianity, are false, in part because of the tragedies that have occurred because of them. He says that if this is true, and if the law that God has put in us is a good law coming from a good God, then how can we have so many atrocities committed by people who follow these laws? Even including those who call themselves Christians and have Jesus as a model of one who washes their feet. And this is where the question is a distraction. This is where his question, in general, that how can there be a good God if we find these actions done in the name of God? How can this good God exist? That question, that is part of his overall argument, and part of the argument that many people make, not only against monotheism, but against Christianity specifically, is a distraction. Pay attention. It's a distraction from principle to practice. It's a distraction from expectation to action. In other words, Jesus gave us a model that we are to follow. And when Christians don't follow that model, Harris and others would say, see, there can't be a good God. Mankind would be better off without religious teaching. We'd be better off to allow the evolutionary march toward well-being to continue. My question is, when I as a father tell my sons and my daughter, don't do this because this will harm you, or do this because this will bring blessings in your life, and they reach a point of their own maturity in which they decide to either do that or not do that. If the thing that I've told them to do, they choose to not do, does that mean that the principle that I, as the father teaching this principle, am the one to be blamed? What if I continually tell them? What if I tell them in firm ways? What if I tell them in compassionate ways? What if I plead with them? What if I do all that I can to argue why this particular pathway is what's best for them, and in spite of that, they still choose to do something otherwise? Is it the principles that I have instilled, or have attempted to instill, I should say, in them? Is that the problem? Am I the problem in that scenario? Well, maybe in some ways, because I'm always a inefficient, ineffective model because of my own humanity. But even in that scenario, I think most of us would realize that no, I am not the one to blame in that scenario, that each one has an opportunity to make their own decisions even when they're told what to do. We learned last week that Jesus called his disciples to wash the feet of others. It's a truly amazing expression of Jesus' concern for the well-being of others. Even those who are against him, as we saw with Judas. He washed Judas's feet. It's impossible. It's impossible to read the beginning of John 13 and leave believing that Jesus Christ taught his disciples to harm others or to hurt others or to oppress others. This conclusion cannot in any way be extracted from this account. Someday I'd like to expand upon this argument that those who reject God and challenge Christianity have placed before us. But at this point, I want to help us understand this in relation to John 13. And note that Christianity cannot in any way allow for harming, hating, oppressing others, even if Christians have done this in other parts or other times and places throughout the globe, throughout history. Interestingly, the only non-Christian emperor of the Roman Empire was a man named Julian. Julian was a relative of the famous Constantine. Constantine is the one to whom the spread of Christianity is connected. If Christianity would not have spread as it had because of Constantine. If Constantine had not made it the official religion of the empire. This is a common argument. I'll show you this here in a moment. Julian, who reigned from 361 to 363, was a relative of Constantine's. He attempted during his reign to move the empire from Christianity back to what Christians call paganism, and what he called the true religion, what he called the accurate belief, what he believed was true. He wanted to move it back to the Roman religious traditions. And he wrote a letter to the priests in the region of Galatia. Interestingly enough, we talked about Galatia in a series not too long ago. So Galatia here in essentially central, south-central, modern-day Turkey. He sent a letter to the Roman priests, those who were in the Roman religion, advising them on what they needed to do in order to expand the Roman traditions. He told them that, in essence, they need to follow the model that the Christians have laid out. He wrote this: "Do we not realize that what has really contributed to the growth of atheism?" Note, here this means Christianity. He sees Christianity as the false religion. And for him, Christianity is atheism. He says, do we not realize that what has really contributed to the growth of atheism is their generosity towards strangers, their care for the burial of the dead, and the dignified way of life that they feign. Feign means to fake. So he says this is the reason why it is growing, because they do these good things, and they have this dignified way of life, but it's all a facade. He continues this, I think we ought genuinely to be making each of these areas our business. It's a good business model. We need to do the same thing, he tells his followers, or he tells his priests. Shortly thereafter, he says this, establish numerous hospices in each city so that strangers experience generosity at our hands, not only our co-religionists, but also others, whoever is in need. In other words, set up places that care for the poor and the needy and the sick. Don't just set it up for our people, set it up for everybody else. Why? Because this is what the Christians did. The Christians cared for anyone, for everybody. It didn't matter if they were Christian or not. He continues, for it is disgraceful that when no Jew has to beg, and the ungodly Galileans, this is a reference to Christians, Jesus of Galilee, and the ungodly Galileans support their own needy and ours, our people are seen to lack assistance from us. Isn't it interesting how out of step the modern critics of Christianity are from those of the earliest centuries? Another atheist named Christopher Hitchens, in a debate with a Christian named Frank Turek, towards the end of the debate, gave this piece of information that he seems to have thought was particularly powerful. He was prodding the Christian, Frank Turek, who had said that the truth of the Bible teaching was what spread Christianity. The reason why Christianity spread was by virtue of the truth of its teaching. Christopher Hitchens said, you have made this claim. You said that this is the reason why Christianity has spread. He said, was it this, or was it, quote, because the Emperor Constantine decided to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire? When you watch the video, when he says this, you can almost sense a smugness in him, as if he has arrived at this, what we call gotcha moment. I gotcha. Take that one. The Emperor Julian, the one that Christians called the apostate, because he was trying to move the empire away from Christianity back to the Roman religious traditions, disproves entirely Christopher Hitchens' argument. It's a contemporary account in which Julian, a contemporary of Constantine, says that the reason why Christianity is growing, and Julian, an opponent, would be in the field with Christopher Hitchens against Christianity. Julian himself says the reason why Christianity is spreading is because they do good works, because they care for the poor, because they care for the sick, because they don't discriminate between Jew or Christian or Roman. They will help anybody. And he says to his own priest, follow what the Christians do. In other words, Julian debunks what Hitchens is arguing. This past week in Myanmar, a country that's gone through great tragedy this past week, a nun named Anne Rose Nu Tuang protected protesters who had run into the clinic that she worked at. And she knelt down in front of the soldiers who were in the police who were going to come in and take these. She knelt down before them, and if you watch the interview that I've posted here, you can find it on BBC News. She says that she pled with them, haven't we had enough suffering? And she said this, kill me instead. Where does that come from? Where does that sense This nun in Myanmar is doing what? Is kneeling in front of armed police. What did Jesus do before his disciples? He knelt down before them and he washed their feet. Our first sermon in the series last week was rising up by kneeling down. And this week, we've had another example of the power of that. What do these police do? Look at the police around them, showing deference to her, and they left. Haven't we had enough suffering? Kill me instead. Now, it's true that Christians don't always apply the teachings of Jesus as they should. And if you and I were honest with ourselves, we'd say that we ourselves don't always apply the teachings of Jesus as we should. There are many things that we know that we are supposed to do and we don't do them. This has certainly harmed Christianity. It's harmed Christianity's reputation. It's harmed the reputation of Christians. Because unfortunately, when Jesus speaks, his followers don't always listen. That's where the problem lies. Not in Jesus' speech, but in the application of it by his followers. And this is exactly what we come across in John chapter 13. The rest of John chapter 13 tells us that if you want to rise up in your faith and service, you must listen up. And not just listen for the sound, but hear. Hear what Jesus is saying. Hear what Jesus is saying, and not hear what you want to hear. Listen up. I'm not speaking of all of you after Jesus told them that they should do this and that one is going to betray him. I'm not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen. But the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of the disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. Most biblical scholars believe that this is John himself, referring to himself in the third person. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then, after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, what you are going to do, do quickly. Now no one at the table knew why he had said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money back, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. Jesus has given the disciples an expression of service. Do this. As I've done to you, you do to one another. Serve one another. Care for one another. Judas's response was betrayal. It says in the beginning, as we saw last week, in the beginning of John chapter 13, that Satan, already having put this plan into his heart, began this. Now here we find that Jesus, when he gave him this morsel, when he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Do we understand this literally or figuratively, the rebellion of Satan? We already know that the plan had been seated in his heart prior, because Jesus says this before he actually washes their feet. He knows what Judas is about to do. He understands that this is Judas's plan. In other words, Judas, instead of serving, betrays. I would say he willingly and defiantly does not get the point that Jesus is trying to make. This is not an innocent mistake. It's not a one-time failure. This is a planned deceit. This is intentional betrayal. This is what I call blatant rebellion. It says, Jesus said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me. And whoever receives me receives the one who sent me." In other words, if you receive and you care for the one, receiving much more than simply greeting, receiving, washing their feet, caring for them as Jesus has just given them an example. As they do this, he says, you're receiving me. And if you receive me, then you're receiving the one who sent me. In other words, you're receiving God the Father. And in other words, Judas was neither receiving Jesus himself, nor was he receiving the Father. He was rejecting them both. This passage reminds me that some people hear and turn away in blatant rebellion against God. Even as in this case, when they directly experience the love of Jesus. Judas directly experienced in the upper room and previously the love of Christ. And yet, he still rejected. He still betrayed. This is open rebellion. Even more, Jesus knew what was going on in Judas's life, as I've just mentioned. And in light of that, this scenario here, when Jesus told Judas, he said, what you are going to do in verse 27, do quickly. Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. I think that Jesus may be giving Judas an opportunity here to change his mind. You'd say, how can I read that into this? Well, follow along with me. We know that this was already established in Judas's mind, and here it was confirmed by Jesus himself, or by John, attributing this to Satan entering Judas. But I want to look at this from this perspective. We as human beings tend to push the limits of morality, especially if we can hide our actions. But when we're exposed, we tend to reconsider. We might reconsider simply in fear of the consequences that might occur to us. For some other reason. Think of, for instance, protests and protesting and violence and protests. When there's no fear of being caught, these can become much more violent. But when police are there, sometimes this keeps protesters from doing things they would normally do. There's a threat. There's an authority saying, I see you. I know what you're planning on doing. But here I stand. Jesus basically tells him, what you've decided to do, go do it. I know what you're going to do, Judas. I know what you're going to do, so-and-so. And the person still does it. That's blatant rebellion. I know what you're going to do. And for some people, they would say, oh, I've been exposed. He knows, she knows what my plan is. So now I say, oh, no, what? Me? Who? Me? No, I would never do that. No, you've got me all wrong. That's not the way that I would behave. No. That wasn't part of my plan at all. You've got to be kidding. I'm just going to go ahead and sit over here. Here it was, you've been exposed, Judas. If you're going to do it, go ahead and do it quickly. And Judas did it. This raises an interesting question on the eternal dilemma found within monotheistic traditions of the problem of predestination and free will. This dilemma of these two poles. Are we predetermined in our actions, or do we have free will? It's interesting that this debate even swirls around in atheistic circles. Determinism versus free will. The passage suggests, when you first read it, that Jesus, in knowing what Judas was going to do, that his actions were in some way predetermined. He was predestined to do this. Jesus already knew it. He didn't try to stop him from doing it. Because this is the question with predetermination. If God knows you're going to do something, and that something is bad, then why doesn't God stop you from doing it? Jesus, knowing, according to verses 1 and 2, what was in Judas's heart, he washed his feet anyways. Knowing what was in Judas's heart, he said, whatever you're going to do it quickly. It suggests that in some ways, his actions were predetermined. They were at least not stopped by a God who knew what was going to happen. But if the sentiment that I'm trying to convey to you is that Judas is an open, blatant rebellion, and Jesus is aware of this, if my reading of the human condition, of humanity, of people, if my anthropology is in any way relevant, which I experience in my own life, I've seen it in my kids and I've seen it in others, that when people are tempted to do something, but they know that they've been exposed, only the blatantly rebellious go ahead and do it. Many times we would say, oh, I can't do it now. This is one of the objectives of the police and of showing force in a protest. We are here watching. The blatantly rebellious say, we don't care, and we're going to fight through and do whatever we want to achieve our ends. It doesn't matter who's watching. It doesn't matter who's the authority. And I think what we find here, that if what I'm suggesting about Jesus' interaction with Judas is correct, that Jesus is giving him an opportunity to back out. Jesus knelt before him and washed his feet. It's an opportunity to back out. It's an opportunity for Judas to say, how can I betray this man? Jesus looks at him and says, in essence, I know what you are going to do. Do it quickly. And Judas's response is not, what? Who? Me? No, you've got me all wrong, Jesus. You got the wrong guy. It's not me. I'd never do something like that, Jesus. Everything's okay. Things are chill between the two of us. This is not Judas's response. What does Judas do? He gets up and he leaves. What I think we find in this story is that it's an indication of the extent of our rebellious nature. That God knows we are rebellious. God knows we have this in us. And even until the last minute, he tells us that he knows. I know what you're thinking. I know what you would do. And many of us, indeed every single one of us, at one point in our lives, has chosen the rebellion. Every one of us has chosen rebellion against God at some point in our lives. with no shame. Okay, I'll do it. And then we present intellectual arguments, questioning how a good God could judge mankind. How is it right for a good God to judge mankind? Because mankind is certainly not worthy of this. I think what Jesus is trying to show us here is the extent of our rebellious nature. Now, some of you might be saying, yes, but what about all the 11? We're going to get to that, the 11 others. We'll get to them in a moment. But I want you to grapple with this reality that at some point in your life, you have rebelled against God in a similar way that Judas has. I should say that Judas did. And what you've known, and God has warned you. He's shown you goodness. He's shown you kindness. He has metaphorically washed your feet. And you've said, I can still betray this guy. I can still betray this being. It's okay with me. And then God tells us, I know what's going on in your life. And you say, well, that's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyways. If you're honest with yourselves, you would admit this. I must admit that this is who I am. And it's only by falling down before Christ and asking Him to save me out of this ungodly, sinful predicament that I could possibly do what is right in a way that would please Him. Listen up, Judas. Listen up. Don't go down this road of blatant rebellion. The disciples who are sitting around when they hear what Jesus said, they thought that He was going out to buy something for the feast because Judas was in charge of the money, interestingly enough. John makes a point of this. Judas is in charge of the money, and he's about to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He's interested in the money. Money was the factor for Judas. He made money on this betrayal. His disciples say, the other disciples say, where's Judas going? Oh, he must be going to buy something for the feast, or maybe he's going to give something to the poor during this feast time. But in fact, he was not going out to buy for them. He was not going out to donate to others. He was going out to line his own pockets. Let me ask you this. What is it that distracts you from hearing what Jesus is actually saying? For some of you, it may be money. For others, it may be something else. Simply selfishness. No one's going to tell me what to do. It may be pride. I'm just as good, so why should I defer my decisions to somebody else? I'll make my own decisions. It could be a career. It could be because of family. It could be because of friends. What are the things what distracts you from hearing Jesus? Learn from Judas. And listen up. God is giving you another opportunity. He's telling you, even now, to listen up, to understand your rebellious nature, to understand that you have been, and at any moment in your life, could slip into Judas's blatant rebellion. Be careful. Listen up. Hear what I'm saying. The disciples can't hear it. They don't understand. Judas hears it, but he rejects it. He hears, but he doesn't listen. He hears, but he doesn't grasp. And he betrays. Listen up. We find this same failure to hear and understand in the rest of this passage. When he had gone out, Jesus said, when Judas had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. What a great statement. What a great commandment. Here, let me tell you what I want you to do. Love others. People will know who you are if you love others. They will know you're my disciple. They will say, that person must be a Christian because he has love for one another. What is Peter's response? Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Did you catch that? Jesus said, where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Did you see it? He says, God's about to glorify me. The Father's about to glorify me. If God is glorified in him, in the Son of Man, in Jesus, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Think of the magnitude of this statement. Jesus is coming to the end of his life. Everything that he's been doing leads to this. And he says, I'm about to be glorified by God. And like I told you, where I'm going to be going now, you're not going to be able to follow me, just like I told the Jews. Where I'm going, you cannot come. But I want you to remember this. I want you to love others. Use the example that I just shared with you. And if you do this, then everyone around you will know that you are my disciples because of your love for one another. And Peter says, where are you going? That's what he focuses on. The next question is not, Lord, how can we love others? The answer is, where are you going? Peter, like we, hears what he wants to hear. Peter's often described as the spokesperson of the disciples. We've already seen the disciples misinterpreted what Jesus was saying and doing with Judas, and then when Judas left, they heard something else. They saw something else. Judas, when he heard what Jesus was saying, he didn't listen. He heard something else. Peter, when Jesus tells them, I'm going to be glorified and I want you to show who I am by loving others, focuses on the second issue that Jesus raised, which is, I'm going to a place and you cannot follow me. That's his focus. They focus on the thing that's important to them. And what's important to them is not the primary objective. Their focus is on something that's secondary. It's important to note that the secondary issue is often the one that reveals a greater concern for ourselves than it does for God. Peter's emphasis on the secondary was an emphasis on himself. And let me tell you this, that is virtually the truth all the time. The primary objective of God is for us to love others and to show an example of Jesus Christ to the world around us. We focus on the secondary issues. God provides for us and God cares for us. God doesn't want us to be destitute, so I need to work. It's good to have a positive self-image, so I want to focus on me and what's important to me. It's not necessarily wrong. Where Jesus was going and Peter's desire to be with him was not necessarily wrong, but it was secondary. It was not the point. Judas betrays and makes some money not serving others. Peter opts for knowing where Jesus is going over loving and caring and serving others. Secondary issues are easier. I think that's why we focus on these. They allow us to believe that what we are doing is good, that what we're doing is right. They allow us to think that we are being good believers, that we're committed, when indeed our focus is actually off. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. That's what Jesus is trying to get them to understand. I coach the women's varsity basketball team at a high school here in Beirut called the American Community School. A few years ago, we were in a game in which we were losing by 1 point at the end of the game, and there were a few seconds left, so I called a timeout in order to draw up a play for hopefully to win the game. And so what I did is what I would commonly do. I brought all the players. I told the ones who were on the bench moved away while the players sat right in front of me, as they normally would. And I looked at them all. I said, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of distraction. People were nervous and jumping around. I had all 5 ladies in front of me, and I said, look at me. Don't talk to them. I said, look at me. I didn't want them to be distracted, looking at this here, that there. I wanted to focus on me. So I said this, look at me, listen up. It's what I do often. Look at me, listen up. I said, listen up. This is what we're going to do. And I took out my board and my marker, and I drew a play. I erased it. I drew it again. I erased it. I drew it again. I said, does everybody understand exactly what we're going to do? They all looked at me, nodded, yes, we know. I said, okay, hands in, let's go. We go out and we set up on the court for the play. The referee takes the ball, handed it to the lady who was taking the ball, my player who was taking the ball out of bounds. And I told them in the play, once the ball is handed to so-and-so, to our player, we move. The play starts then. There's no go, it's boom, and we go. So get out there, get set, be ready. So we get set. He handed the ball to the lady out of bounds. And once he did, everyone started to move. And the person that we were running the play for ran in the opposite direction. I looked and said, what? Needless to say, we lost. It's only a game, wasn't a big deal. Afterwards, we sat down, and I drew the play up again, and I said, this is what we were trying to achieve. And I left it at that. I don't want to call out anybody, just wanted to remind them. And I said, I understand. I've been there. I played basketball for years. I understand. Those are stressful moments. And we can be distracted by things that are going on around us. Even when someone sits down in front of us, and you know what I do as a coach? I'm kneeling in front of them. I'm actually below these ladies. They're sitting on the bench or sitting in chairs, and I'm kneeling on the ground in front of them. I'm kneeling right before them. And I'm telling them, here, this is what I want you to do. Listen up. You're going to be tempted in life to sin and to be rebellious. I want you to listen up. You're going to be tempted to focus on the things that are secondary and not on the most important issues. I want you to listen up. Jesus got his disciples in a place, in an upper room, in which he wanted to teach them how they were to rise up as followers of Christ, as followers of him. And he knelt down in front of them, and he washed their feet, and he gave them an example. Listen up. Look at me. Watch what I'm telling you. The play was pretty straightforward. He knew that there was a lot of stress. He knew that the stress of life, drawing them to rebellion, was powerful. He understood that. He looked at Judas. He understood the power of that rebellious nature in him. But I think he gave him options. He washed his feet. He said, I know what you're doing. Judas did it anyways. He makes the play easy because he understands the stress that is going on in our lives and the temptations that we have in us and our frailty. And when the game is on, sometimes we get a little bit, we say in Arabic, mulabbak, right? We get a little bit mixed up. We get a little bit messed up. And we forget what we're supposed to do. Jesus understands that. He draws the play multiple times for us. He wants to remind us, listen. He keeps it a simple play. And the simple play is this: don't submit to your rebellious nature, like Judas. Instead, love one another, like I've just told you. But don't get focused on the secondary. It's pretty simple. Avoid the rebellion, love God, and love one another. This is what he's trying to convey to us. And I think he does this because he understands where we are. And he understands the problems that we face. And he wants to remind us and keep it simple for us to love one another. In each of these scenarios, the scenario of Judas and the scenario of Peter, in each of these, God is trying to teach us a lesson that can sustain us through very difficult circumstances. He's trying to teach us what it really means to rise up. And if you want to rise up, you must listen up. You must be aware of blatant rebellion. You must be aware of misplaced priorities, making the secondary the primary. And it's only by hearing what Jesus is actually saying and not deciding to hear what we want to hear that we can truly please God, that we can truly receive him and receive the one who sent him, the Father, and that we can actually find peace in the middle of the trials around us. Listen up. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We ask, Lord, that you'd help us to hear, to listen to what you're saying, and to do what you're saying. We ask this all in Christ's name. Amen.